So our next spotlight speaker is on the topic of Southeast Bioenergy Resource Assessment. As we're based in the Southeast, we decided to do a specific Southeast focus session. The aim of this session is to articulate the bioenergy resource and the opportunity in the region, with the view to that being reflected or replicated right across the country. Similar to the work that Paddy Phelan has been doing in the Southeast, a similar project is underway in the Midlands through the Midlands Just Transition Bioenergy Development Programme. This Erbia project has been led by our colleague Pádraig O'Higgins, who's on our social media today and is here and happy to talk to any attendees who would like to find out more about that project. So we now have a presentation from Paddy Phelan, and we'll then have a short panel discussion. I will introduce the panel after Paddy's presentation, and Paddy will briefly chair the panel discussion, and we will break for lunch at 1:40. So over to you, Paddy, to give your presentation, and then I'll introduce the panel from there. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Sean. Nothing like a challenge between everybody and their lunch. So I'll rephrase Sean's note, and I'll say a short presentation by me, followed by a possibly longer, more interesting discussion with some of the key stakeholders. So just before I start, the context of what we have looked at within the Energy Agency is, we know there's a potential. I've been looking at this potential for more than a decade now. I was in this room in 2011 with Mary Donnelly when she was DG Climate, or what is now DG Climate, but Energy Director in Europe. And we discussed the opportunity for a virtual pipeline for gas, the opportunity to bring the dairy industry into that model. They can move milk from A to B by truck. They don't have pipes to connect that milk supply. And I'm delighted to say that before Christmas this year, we will have a virtual pipeline in place in County Kilkenny and in County Wexford, with the local authorities, again, taking a lead in the context of an offtake of gas, because they're not connected by the gas grid, to take renewable gas from a very local supply chain. So that's 11 years ago that we stood in this room. We were standing that direction, talking that way. So I'm not sure what direction conversation has changed. But what we decided to do in the Energy Agency, and without delaying too long, we've now become a regional entity since last year, but we rebranded last week, I should say, from our original foundation in 2002, representing Carlow and Kilkenny. We're now covering the 4 counties in the southeast. And before people ask where's South Tipperary in that, under the NUTS 3 European Regional Act of 2014, South Tipperary County Council are now part of Tipperary, which is part of the Midwest region under the Southern NUTS 2 region. So I'm a South Tipperary man originally, so not altogether pleased about that, but that's the way the regions are set up. Quickly going through the slides, and again, this study is being launched early next week, so we'll get circulated to anybody who's interested. If they go on to the southeastenergy.ie and express an interest, we will circulate it. But it's an evidence-based piece at a regional level. So you've had Paul Dean on the stage earlier on today and other scientists. And what we identified is that we need to get an evidence-based approach to this. So this really just looks at the boundaries of what's potentially available. Again, looking at the EU policy, we've touched on it on every session, right up to Fit for 55, all of the different plans, interconnecting across, whether it's the CAP reform, whether it's the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. All of these, there's about 10 or 12 different arms of European policy that under Fit for 55 are being addressed to deal with. And all of them consider an opportunity and provide a window through which bioenergy can play its role. Again, there's a big tranche of money that's been approved at a European level in terms of financing, and this is about Repower EU. And as on my role with the European Biogas Association and our work on the scientific board, we're delighted to see the ambition at the European level much increased on foot of energy security and Europe becoming an energy independent continent. And the opportunity is very great in the southeast region. Again, at a national level, we have the Climate Action Plan, we have the Climate Bill. You've been through all of these this morning. They've come up with various elements along the road. But if we take this down to a very practical level, so won't get into the nitty-gritty, this is a snapshot of the energy consumption in the southeast region across the 4 counties that I have already illustrated on the previous slide. So as you can see, 29% transport, 28% residential, industry 24%, commercial SME, public sector, ag and fisheries. So again, that's the national picture. So we've slightly less transport, equivalent residential, and so on and so forth. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go through these quite quickly with a view to getting our panel onto the stage. Here's a breakdown of the emissions reduction targets by 2030 and how they impact this specific region. So in the southeast, we need to see industry reduce its emissions by 40%, transport between 45 and 60, residential 40 to 55, commercial services 40 to 45, and public sector 51%. So broadly speaking, I would argue we're heading for a half reduction, and you've had Paul Dean on the stage already this morning, and apologies, he couldn't stay, he had to get to another engagement. But we're talking from the same place here. 18 months into our first 5-year tranche of Paris Climate Agreement emissions, we're increasing emissions, not reducing them. And that's not for the want of trying for people within this room, and I would say with an argument, not for the want of the people within this region. So something is holding this back. So rather than consider it and look at all the policies and all the papers, we want to get back to the reality of action. So what we've identified, and this is evidence-based, backed by Marriott UCC, one of the very eminent consultants and scientists, we've identified this is the potential for the southeast region. And ironically, when you analyse it on the right-hand side here, you can see that if we optimise the biogas piece, that it could provide 56.5% of the total energy that's required within the region. And that's not allowing for any energy efficiency that might and will be implemented. Another arm of what we do in the Energy Agency in partnership with many of the actors at local, national and European level is to implement aggregation of energy efficiency, so insulation, lighting, retrofits, all of the elements that help us reduce the amount of energy that we need to produce either a living standard or a product. But fundamentally, we've identified that the resource is there. So within the southeast region, if we add up wind, solar, biogas and tidal potential, we can decarbonise this region. And going back to the earlier paraphrase from an Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, we could actually become a net exporter of energy, not from Ireland Inc., but also from this region. So instead of importing 87%, and we have an increased import of fossil fuels in 2021, and we're heading for a further increase in 2022, instead of reducing it, we're actually increasing it. So we've been doing a lot of talking, we've been doing a lot of policy writing, we've been doing an awful lot of discussion and opportunity, but this is the potential. So what we have suggested, and that's just some of the detail in terms of the study. Again, there's a lot more detail, I'm not going to get into the science, but we have the technologies, that's the point. We have the CHP, we have the biomethane, we have the biomass heating systems. We've seen Gerard Cross show us the watershed just in the road. We have the machinery yard belong to the local authority moving to road transported biogas through canistered biomethane provision. So we can do it, so why is it not happening? Again, in terms of sustainable biomethane, through experience and work and being from the southeast, from a small tillage background, I understand and appreciate that by doing cover crops, by bringing back in traditional rotation crops that are needed in a food production tillage industry, that's broadly being replaced with, oilseed rape is particularly the break crop at the moment, but beet used to be a break crop, and beet can provide, alongside within food production. Cover crops, again, across the double cropping, so you can grow cover crops on a tillage crop as a second crop, particularly where you have spring crops, and you can collect that and you can use it to produce biomethane. Grass silage, again, not looking at increasing or overproducing from existing in-use land, but looking at maybe some diversification from struggling sectors that might, have a better, more sustainable future, both economically, but also in terms of emissions reduction. And again, contributing from an agricultural perspective to the overall decarbonisation. And just, I suppose, from the economic element of it, when you analyse, sorry, just before I go on the wood energy potential, again, the study is looking at. So all of these resources are there. They're locally available. We have the evidence base, so it has been completed, albeit at a very small scale in individual and quite, I would say, dedicated cases where, you know, people have taken it on, people that have been in this industry for many years now, unsupported, I suppose, is the phrase I would use. They've had taken the initiative themselves, they've taken the risk, they've been the early movers. So the evidence is there. This is just a picture from a biomethane production plant right on North Waterford, South Kilkenny border. That's producing renewable energy that's been transported by road to supply 2 local authority buildings this year. And overnight, once they transition from their existing oil supplies, because they're not connected to a gas grid, they will become 100% renewable under all RED II directives, under all aspects of consideration, and that will contribute towards their 51%. And again, I go back to the different sectors and how far they all have to travel in terms of decarbonising. So it's not a different technology. The public sector have to reduce their emissions by 51%. It's the same type of gas that they would use in many buildings, in natural gas. But the opportunity is there for them to convert overnight from a fossil-intensive fossil gas to a renewable gas, and it's supplied within 25 miles of where they're using the heat. It's not coming from the Ukraine, or it's not coming from outside of the southeast region. So I think these are the steps and the projects that we're seeing, both through the work of the local authorities, the energy agencies, Erbia members, SMEs, businesses, universities, colleges. Southeast Technical University are doing a lot of work in this space as well around decarbonising the region. So there's a will, there's a way. So I suppose what we're going to discuss in the discussion panel with some of the key actors who have, you know, integrated parts in assisting us to get to where they are, that's what we're going to touch through in terms of the discussion panel. So that brings my presentation to a close. I'm conscious that we have 10 to 12 minutes now, possibly 15 for the panel discussion, and through that I'm going to talk through some of the questions with our panellists that maybe might be perceived to be or seen to be some of the reasons why we haven't been able to convert this, again, potential energy into real energy that's available locally. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks very much, Paddy, for your very comprehensive presentation.